Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, the word sustainability has become very common in so many areas in 2024. But my guest today has been involved in this at a very grassroots level and not just talking the talk, but walking the walk for over 30 or more years, and is a truly inspiring figure. My guest is Michael Mobbs. Now, Michael began life as an environmental lawyer, but then, I don't want to spoil it, he has put into practice and has been living a sustainable life that is a true inspiration to anybody who takes that concept seriously. Michael is the author of two wonderful books, The Sustainable House and Sustainable Food. It's a wonderful and inspiring conversation and story. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Michael Mobbs. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Michael, in Sydney, probably internationally actually, anyone who has been remotely interested in sustainable living in the city in the last 25 or 30 years would know your name. I certainly have heard of you and read about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your story, how you got started?
I started engaging with the world firstly as a lawyer, and then after about 19 years of that, I realized that it wasn't working for me. I was the first so-called environmental lawyer in 1978, I think, and worked for a firm that is one of the oldest in Australia, and then I set up my own firm, and I really thought that the law offered some guardrails and it could be relied upon more or less to protect the environment. And it took me a long time to learn that it wasn't, that the law can be used by those who understand it for both good and for bad. And so I left the law. The immediate transition from being a fleeing lawyer to being somebody doing something more tangible was in 1993-94. I was the consultant to the New South Wales Parliament inquiry into Sydney water, where the Parliament was asking how we're going to manage Sydney's water, sewage and stormwater. I did the technical and wrote the report and recommendations to Parliament, and most of it was ignored. So that was frustrating, Ron, and I was married with two young children, and I decided to during a 3-month renovation when we wanted a bigger kitchen and bathroom for the growing family, to do the things that were in the report. So in 1996, I disconnected the house from water, sewage and stormwater during that 3-month kitchen and bathroom renovation, just for my own self. I had no idea that it would lead over the years to conversations with the wider public and to me sitting here talking to you about it. But it seems to me that the true answer to your question, when did it start for me, was when I was on the farm as a kid and I saw the floods and the droughts. When you grow up with Earth's seasons so viscerally and you experience them so firsthand, I think it makes you aware of the need to live a way which can sustain you in the context of floods and droughts and so on. You'll probably never ask me another question because I gave you such a long answer, but
you've given me a great. No, no, you've actually opened up so many other questions there. I mean, the fact that you grew up on the farm, I mean, farming has been a passion of this program, regenerative agriculture, and I've been in healthcare and I've recognized the link between food from soil to plate and what a nutrient dense diet means and what a challenge a nutrient dense diet is given the soils we have. So your foundation of farm and soil there speaks to my heart very closely. I can understand why you would go into perhaps not law, but environmental law. Well, I could understand that. And environmental law in 1978. I mean, environmental movement in the 70s and 80s. If you had to characterize the biggest change between the way that was viewed in the 70s and 80s and the way it's viewed today, what do you think the biggest change is there?
I think there's a loss of hope and trust. In the 70s, there was a huge debate about beginning to mine uranium in Australia. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to say no. And I was one of them. I remember getting off a train at North Sydney Station and walking over the bridge. The train and the bridge were just packed for hours. People got out and did things today because I think largely because it doesn't matter what you do, the people in power are more closely connected to their funders, to people and groups which use the political system to maintain their business. People are not silly. They participate in less, trust less the political system. So you don't see that visible display. And the displays you do see are more extreme. People tying themselves to bridges and to train tracks and to things like that. The form of expression has become more desperate, perhaps in proportion to the disappointment that people have in the process for protecting Earth.
Do you think the process, I mean, you must have gone into environmental law with, a great deal of optimism and hope, and you were there for 17, 18, 19 years, you said. Do you think the process that you went through in realizing that actually the law could work for you and against you, and the law working against environment had much stronger influence? Do you think that process that you went through at that time is a process society has gone through over the last 30 or 40 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I was directly involved in it, but people who weren't, who were going to be teachers or researchers or bus drivers or mums and dads who weren't as directly involved in it, it took them and a lot of disappointment over particular projects where people discovered they weren't being listened to. It took decades for people to realise that the system of government in Australia is basically one where the politicians have been seduced by the people who are damaging Earth. And so there's a proportionate or an equal reaction from people who sense that truth and don't participate in the process much.
I mean, I've been interested in healthcare, nutritional medicine, and that has led me into environmental medicine as well. And the thing I realize about our healthcare system is, and I've said this often on the podcast, our current system is a great economic model, but it's not a very good health model. And I think when we come to look at the environment, there's a lot of similarities there, isn't it? It's a
Yes,
great economic model. It's just not a very good environmental model.
yeah. The companies who make drugs, the companies who sell cars. I mean, take cars. There used to be train tracks and trams in much of American cities and small towns. And it was the car industry which led to them being ripped up so that people were obliged to buy cars. You just have to walk out onto a busy road in the morning or evening when people are coming and going to work, particularly in much of Sydney and other cities in the world where people are condemned to an hour or 30 or more minutes of travelling with so many of their fellow citizens in cars, one to a car, and realise that the car industry have won the debate. It's amazing to me that in Sydney we're still building freeways when it was realised decades ago that no matter how many freeways you build, they get filled up by cars. And the only way to move a lot of people efficiently is in public transport. But it's a debate we keep having because the people who run those investment and development companies sit down and have dinner with and share company with the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Environment Minister. So, I mean, in New South Wales, the most recent example of that is where the new state government came into power saying it would slow down coal and gas. Well, the Minister for the Environment went right against all those written policies and said, oh no, we need them. So it's not surprising, Ron, that people learn that politicians mostly can't be trusted, that their vote has little influence, and they really take only a brief temporary interest in elections when in Australia they're compelled by law to go and vote. I think if we took away the compulsion, the voting would go from 98% people voting down to the mid-50s or something like that. People like you and I, ordinary citizens, don't trust politicians, don't trust the process anymore.
Well, it does. It could sound a little it is a bit depressing, in fact, but this idea that this concept of a government by the people for the people has kind of morphed into a government by the corporations for the corporations, and this whole idea of trickled. Oh, we could get into neoliberalism and the market-driven economy and all of that. I don't think it would be particularly a wonderful thing to go down. We certainly could. But I think what's interesting, Michael, is that just as you saw what law could and couldn't do and decided to do, and you saw that years before other people did, you decided to do something about it. And in the same way, you saw that many years before we are now catching up with your thinking and thinking, how can I, as an individual, make a difference? I mean, you had a law background, you renovated your kitchen, and you must have dealt with council regulations. What are some of the challenges in that process that you went through?
Getting approvals from local, state or federal governments requires giving those consent authorities the information they need to make a decision within the laws and regulations. To that extent, those decision makers in governments are no different to a computer. If they don't have a program that enables them to approve a sustainable project, the only answer they can give a proponent wanting to do something that's sustainable is no. Not because they disagree with it necessarily, but simply because they have no decision-making power to say yes. So knowing that helped me. So I didn't, in 1996, ask for approval for all of the things, particularly recycling sewage, because I knew there was no law empowering the council to approve it. I simply asked for approval for 2 tanks. and they were described as water tanks, and they are. It's just that one is used for rainwater and the other is used for treating sewage. Actually, it's a good time for us to talk, Ron, because this morning the trees outside my house were being pruned by contractors for Ausgrid. Almost 50 years ago, I was so alarmed at the way street trees were being pruned to make way for electricity cables that I worked with the council and, in this case, Ausgrid, that controls and builds and owns and operates those cables in our streets, to achieve bundling, where the several wires are combined into one bundle and they are more or less impervious to brushing up against tree trunks and branches. So I was shocked to see the trees being given a punk hairdo this morning. And I spoke to the people with the chainsaws. I said, but look at this, we've got all the bundling, and Ausgrid and the council worked out that we could stop all this 40 years ago. Why are you doing this? And they said, Ausgrid has decided they need 2 metres between overhead power lines and tree branches. And we're just doing what they want to do. So in the public domain, where you and I walk on the footpath or drive or walk across or on roads, there are about, I think, 20 odd different governments. There's Ausgrid, there's Sydney Water, there's the energy companies, the gas companies, and all that, and they're all little fiefdoms. And they've each got this amount of the footpath or the road allocated to them. They can do whatever they want there without approval. These guys were just doing their job as instructed by Ausgrid. So I now have to go and re-argue that to stop it happening. It was copied through most of the Sydney City Council area. And that's why we have in Chippendale, I'm showing with my fingers interlocking, tree canopy. That's called pleaching, with the trees intersect. We have streets here which are 10 to 15 or more degrees cooler on a 40-degree day than streets without the shade. So trees are free air conditioners. So that part of that street outside my house, those houses will be very hot this summer. And it shows another aspect of the debate about what to do and not to do with natural resources is sometimes, as in the case of tree pruning here, you have to go and argue the case again. The idea of having 2 metres between Ausgrid power lines and trees means effectively there's going to be crew cuts of trees all across Sydney. And all that would do is drive up aircon use as people desperately try to cool their houses. And there's an image taken at night of Sydney by Sydney City Council. A plane flew over Sydney between, I think, 3 and 4 in the morning to take a heat map. And you can see that the roads are over 20 and 30 and 40 degrees, depending on the absence or presence of trees. That's why the council here is one of the few councils in Australia which is actually putting in more trees than it's cutting down. And so I hope to receive a supportive hearing when I go to council about what's happening in our streets, to try and rein in Ausgrid and stop this crew cutting of trees. I've also spoken to somebody who did a wonderful design in Victoria Park, which is a big park near Sydney University, and it drains hundreds of millions of water to Blackwattle Bay, which is the most polluted part of Sydney Harbour. And they put in some landscaping to keep water in the park so that the suspended solids could be dropped. The water wouldn't flow as fast, and now you've got some dense reeds growing there, and it's cooler. So I spoke to this person who was involved in the design and implementation of those stormwater works, and he said people have gone on from council and other people, and they're now thinking of getting in a diesel-powered engine to pump oxygen in the water to take to make it take away algal blooms. When in fact, all of the increased sedimentation in that work has actually come from Sydney University, which is upstream, did some building works and poured hundreds of tonnes of sediment off the site into the public park below. This is a revered seat of learning, building a thing, and you could just... So there's no necessary virtue in universities, quite the opposite. So there's this constant tension between people who have some respect for Earth, want to nurture her, keep her well, and others who just don't care.
But Michael, we come back to the economic model, and we talk about cheap commodities. But the problem with the so-called cheap commodities, and we could pick anyone really, clothing, food, building, all of this sort of stuff, the environmental and health costs are never factored in. They're always externalized and put onto the public register. Oh, well, if there's a health problem, you'll deal with it. If there's an environmental problem, you'll deal with it. The public will deal with it. Well, they will deal with it either in poor health or extreme costs to fix it, but it's never factored in as a requirement to anything that is produced.
Yeah.
I mean, we did this program. I don't know whether you know Alan Savory. You've heard the word and name of Alan Savory, but Alan says there should be a holistic context which sits over every decision that is made. And there's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if the holistic context that sat over every decision was, is this good for human health? Is this good for environmental health? If the answer to both those questions is yes, then go for it.
It seems
But
obvious,
that's not the
doesn't
case,
it,
is
Ron, that that's a question that would be asked. But if you're Ausgrid, your world is getting those power lines and the energy down them. If you're Sydney Water, it's maintaining your business. Sydney Water is in the top 10 carbon polluters in New South Wales. It's also one of the major contributors to the state government's budget. It makes a fortune. And Sydney Water requires that people use their services. It's very hard to disentangle yourself. Take stormwater. In Sydney, you're obliged, and it's almost inescapable to discharge your stormwater from your house to the street. If you and I were speaking in Adelaide, where they only get a couple of hundred mils of water, and the upstream states of Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria steal all the water from the Murray-Darling, so when it gets to Adelaide, it's too full of salt to use. In Adelaide, 47% of houses have rain tanks, and there's a closer supportive relationship between councils and the health agency there to support rainwater use. And there's a study of 1,100 school children on town water in Adelaide and 1,100 school children on tank water, comparing their gut health. And although they found rats, skeletons and stuff in the gutters of the children having rainwater, their gut health was superior to those having town water, because chlorine contains 4 trihallomethanes, one of which causes 2% of stomach cancers in America. So there's a real support there because of water shortage for rain tanks. Travelling further across Australia to Perth, where most of the water for Perth comes from underground aquifers, you're directed not to discharge the stormwater from your house to the street, but to keep it on site with the goal of recharging the aquifers below the houses and buildings. So the management of water there is quite different to Sydney, and it's because the government agency has a financial and strategic interest in putting that water into the aquifers. So there's what is a sort of biblical truism in Sydney is not in Perth. It's actually just a cultural and strategically different approach. And so I'll tell you where I've come to. I'm 74. I've been bumbling around trying to do something for my lovely earth. And I quote not George Bombay, I think it was a 19th century English poet who says, I love not man the less, but nature more. So my love for earth is my prime motivator. So I looked at the things that you and I are discussing in this conversation. I thought, what can I do that has most strategic potential to do good? And I'm not being rude to you or your readers or listeners when I hold up my middle and other fingers, the three fingers, and ask you to regard them as a bar graph of the three most polluting countries on earth. The most polluting, the middle finger, is China. The second most polluting of earth is America. And then if you graph food waste as pollution as a country, it is the third most polluting country on earth. Because in poor countries, most of the food spoils in the fields or can't be used because they can't get it to market or whatever, or store it. And in rich countries like the one you and I are in, we throw away most of it either in the fields or in transportation or in the marketing of beautiful looking same-sized lemons or whatever it might be. So I've decided in what time I've got left to try and end food waste this year in Chippendale. And so far, the community seems to support it. We've got 16 different compost options in the streets. We're composting 300 to 400 kilos of food waste a week. And I'm now at a stage where I think we can roll it out. We can get some major buy-in from householders, from unit dwellers, and from office building owners or tenants. And so I'm trying to work out what is the most strategically significant contribution I and my community can make. And so far, so good. And it gives me the energy to keep trying to do something that has strategic value.
How does that look? I mean, I have seen when we met recently at the fair there at Pocket City Farm. I did see one of the benches, but just for those that haven't, explain how you've approached this eliminating food waste in Chippendale, which is an inner city suburb of Sydney, where you've lived for what, 30, 40 years now, Michael?
Yeah. So what
Yeah.
happens
How
is,
does that look? How have you
well,
approached that?
so the background was I just started using off-the-shelf worm farms and different versions of compost in Chippendale. I have a really good relationship with the cafe owners, talk to them because there are two markets for food waste. One market is captured with little power to choose the service provider. That's residential people across Australia. The other market can choose their service provider, and that's cafes, units, and offices. They can say, well, I don't like your service or the price, whatever may be important to them. I'm going to use somebody else. So I got a grant after using worm farms and other things from the New South Wales EPA to trial ending cafe food waste in 5 cafes in Chippendale and 5 cafes in Bathurst. So we get some data comparing a city and a country environment. And then the virus hit and that was largely disrupted. But in the course of that, something I was trialling, a cool seat, really got me thinking about compost. Usually it's bald old blokes doing weird things behind trees with weird looking things out the back garden who compost. And I wanted to reframe it as something that anyone could do, no matter whether they were or were not interested in food waste, which had style and elegance and which didn't look like anything else. So after 4 or 5 years of trialing different seats, I think I've come to something that I can go to market with. It's a seat. Visually, it sits in a garden bed, but it projects beyond the garden bed and invites the viewer to sit on it. And then under the seat, there are baskets holding food waste, and either side there are plants fed by nutrients leached from the composting baskets. It's a childish delight for me, Ron, to see people sitting out cafes on some of the earlier prototypes of curl seats, and their faces and jaws drop when I lift the seat adjoining them and put in some food waste or take out some compost. They say, wow, this is a compost. So it doesn't smell. It shocks people who are unaware that they're sitting above food waste. And hopefully I can end food waste in Chippendale in the public domain and reduce the pollution. So just to put a figure on it, it depends, Ron, but taking the most conservative data, which is from Princeton University, they say that when you compost 1 kilo of food waste, that stops 1.5 kilos of climate pollution. So if we're doing 300 or 400 kilos a week, we're stopping 500 or 600 kilos of climate pollution a week. If we can do that and we get greater use of the streets, we might have people who are more possessive and fond of their trees and their footpath gardens, more protective of them, and their voices might also grow to protect the public domain, because the public domain, the roads in Chippendale are 23% of the landmass. In suburbs further out, which are less intensely developed, they're between 27 to 33% of the landmass. So there's a big part of our cities which no one owns except the councils on trust for us, but it's just a playground for gas and oil and energy and sewage and water people to play with as they wish, without regard to trees or amenity and so on. So it's an exciting time for me and for our suburb and people who are wanting to do something real. Imagine, Ron, going outside your house or unit, chucking your food waste in this thing, walking away, and it doesn't smell. I have yet to completely trial all the business dynamics, but I'm hoping that I can create 2 part-time jobs for people who will maintain the compost seats. If we can keep local money in local economies, we can have a much richer society. So when we put our garbage out, the least efficient transport is a garbage truck. It accelerates and stops every 20 or 30 metres. They get about 2 to 3 kilometres to a litre. So they're really inefficient. So if we can turn that...
Well, you know, you'd be pleased to know also, Michael, that another mentor, hero, and friend of mine is Helena Norberg Hodge, who champions local futures and the importance of local community, and I share that passion. And I've seen your seats, and not only, well, you know, how great to provide a public seat that grows plants and provides a compost, which can only improve the soil when we take that compost and put it in the local soil. So it's a win-win-win all around, isn't it?
It is. It increases tree canopy, cools the suburb, increases more diversity for insects and bugs. And I can't see a downside to it. So we'll see how we go, Ron. I'm giving it a go.
But you've mentioned cooling, and you mentioned this bundling of of wires, which I'd not heard before, but I've often seen trees uh, pruned in a really unsympathetic fashion. And you've mentioned also cooling, because we hear a lot about global warming.
Mm.
And, and you went, what on earth can I do about global warming? I could reduce my carbon footprint, but we could actually cool our streets. You've mentioned trees as one thing, but you've approached this cooling of cities by cooling streets from another perspective too, haven't you?
Um, yeah, the truth about water in Sydney is that more water falls as rain and is wasted than is imported as town water. So we actually don't need Sydney water.
Yes.
And the water that's wasted and goes to the most polluted part of Sydney Harbour in Blackwattle Bay gets there because there's not enough water kept. So what we did here about 15 years ago, we had what we called a Food for the Future fair, and on that day we divided up. I think there were about 10 work gangs, people who had never held a shovel, and the council gave us 200 or 300 plants. Some chosen to go on the shady side of streets, others chosen to go on the sunny side, and we planted those trees and plants. But we also put in what I call leaky drains, which sounds unattractive, but the space between the edge of a footpath and the gutter that's occupied by the verge, by a footpath garden, is a ripe place to change the way we deal with water and urban heat. Where the householders agreed, we excavated and exposed the drain, carrying the water from their roof that drained to the street. We dug up the drain and replaced it with a pipe into which we had drilled holes, or you can buy agricultural drainage pipe, which has got lots of holes in it and is covered with geofabric, so it leaks. So now, for a one-off cost of buying that agricultural drainage pipe in 10 or 15 years ago, we're keeping 4 million litres of water each year in our streets, so that the water that falls on those houses irrigates the verges. And so they've gone from being compacted clay to supporting all sorts of edible and decorative plants. And that happens every year for a one-off cost. So we've also done some similar things in the newly renovated park. Here we've put in leaky drains on edges of the park, so when the water runs off the grass or the paths, it goes into that grate, but the grate has no base, it's just got an agricultural drainage pipe, and the water from the park goes into it. I'm looking at you as I say this, Ron. I just think it's amazing that parks are designed to waste rainwater when that water can be kept freely to irrigate the grass, the garden beds, and the trees. And so
Mm. Mm.
I don't know, I don't understand. So we now have fruit trees and edible plants in that garden. We've got about 1,000 fruit trees, herbs and plants in our footpath gardens, most of them fed in that way naturally without town water. And we have to do that because it's a tough place. You can't get enough hoses to irrigate some of the plants. So about 80% of water falls gently and the other 20% comes in a rush. So if we're getting, say, 60% of the rainwater that falls to irrigate their trees, we're keeping millions of water all through the streets now of Chippendale. And that's why we've got really good tree growth here. And that's why I have to have a little chat to try and pull back the the reinvigorated Ausgrid marauders.
Yes, I must say, having walked through Chippendale on occasion, I must say, it's so obvious that there is so much tree growth and healthy tree growth
Yeah.
coming out of the footpath, like it's just incredible. I
Mm,
would observe that. I
mm,
have observed that.
mm,
My wife and I have noted it on
mm.
occasion. Another aspect of cooling, though, and I'm guessing all our roads are black, and black absorbs heat. There's another opportunity there,
Yeah,
isn't there?
I didn't mention that. There's so many ways we can cool our cities. Imagine the thought processes. Australia's a really hot country. Black holds, absorbs, and re-radiates the heat from the sun at night. If you wanted to heat up Sydney, as it is, 10 to 12 degrees above what it needs to be, you'd choose black tar. And to their credit, Sydney Council now use white concrete that's got a lot of recycled materials in it. And in the streets here, they drain to agricultural drainage pipe buried at the intersection of the sloping concrete, so the water goes down to feed the plants. But if you could just go to one of the satellite maps you can get of your suburb, people listening to this would be shocked at the large amounts of black tar which hold the heat and re-radiate it at night to heat it up. And that drives up aircon bills, and um, we've got a lot of work to do to cool our cities down, Ron, and I'm hoping that discussions such as this might be heard by people who are placed to bring about change in road design, water design, and so on. So it's good to talk to you. Thank you.
Yeah, now listen, can I just come back to one thing because it is intriguing to me? You disconnected in 1996 when you were doing your renovation from the water and the sewage, and you said, yes, you put in 2 tanks. Tell me what happens with the sewage. I mean, that must be a big one and a challenging one.
So I'm holding up my fingers to make a circle. Imagine this is a pie chart of the amount of water we use in our houses. We humans excrete 4 to 8 times a day. So half of our water use is used to flush the toilet and wash clothes, which are non-drinking quality functions. So in this house, the sewage is recycled, cleaned up, recycled to flush the toilet and wash the clothes. And that's been going on for 28 years. No sewage or stormwater has left my terrace house garden in 28 years. So I've kept almost 3 million litres in the garden in an area the size of my dining room table. And no one has died drinking rainwater, but the quantitative impact, the physical impact of meeting half the need by recycling the sewage is the water use is halved, so that the water from the rain tank lasts twice as long. And so the shower, kitchen, and basin water is rainwater, and it's been tested to clean. All the data's in the book about the house, Sustainable House. So what happens here is the sewage from the flush toilet, the sinks, and the clothes washing machine goes to a tank, which has at the end of it, it's about 2,500 litres, long skinny tank. When the toilet's flushed or the clothes washing machine goes, it goes through 2 agricultural filters. They're about the size of 2 big eskies, and it's filled with fine, like swimming pool sand, fine swimming pool filter sand that takes the colour and the odour out of it, and then there's some UV lamp to sterilise it. So the water coming back to flush the toilet and wash the clothes. If you go to a restaurant and they've got a fish tank, the fish are swimming in their own excreta. There's a little filter, usually about the size of your thumb or your big finger, and that's using ultraviolet light to disinfect the water so the fish don't die from their own excreta. So it's how big town water systems work. I've just got a small system for my house. And then every 3, 4, 5 years, I replace that filter in the filters with new filter, and I continue on with that. And the testing, the data on that is in the books. But I think the major difficulty is not dealing with it. I'm just doing in the city what farmers do every day in the country, more or less. But I think the major difficulty is not the technical difficulty. It's dealing with the approval process, because the planners
Mm.
and the environmental people in universities are not trained to deal with innovation with water and sewage. They're really controlled by the health and other people in the state. So you'd have a greater sense of success or prospects of it in South Australia, because they're really running out of water. It's even worse in Perth, where the water rainfall has halved in the last 10 years. And if you went to Singapore, you'd get a very supportive hearing, because in Singapore, they have no river system. They have to buy all their water from the adjoining mainland of Malaysia. And Malaysia says to Singapore, when it feels like, look, we think the water's too cheap. We're going to put it up. Singapore has got tired of being financially screwed and are now recycling their sewage and selling it as drink water. And the Prime Minister was in the promotional video in his white tennis shorts and top, playing tennis with a bottle of new water, which is recycled sewage. So they're actively selling and promoting recycled sewage. So how we see the environment depends where we are, and the water or other constraints in that house or suburb or city.
I mean, I've heard it said in London that the water you drink has been drunk 7 times before
Yeah,
you. But I
yeah,
think if we were taking an even more holistic view, the water that we're all drinking has been drunk for hundreds of thousands of years in one
that's
form or
right.
another.
That's right.
Uh, so 7 times is probably really fresh.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. What about energy? Is another one that's obviously a big one, and compared to where you were in 1996, where we all are now, well, not all, but many people are now, energy-wise. How does it all stack up in your house?
It's wonderful to be alive now. There's so much wonderful stuff happening. To give you a financial expression of that, when I put in the solar panels along with the recycled sewage and water in 1996, my solar panels cost me $26,000 of the $48,000, which was the total budget of going off grid. Today, the same power in solar panels would cost about $900 to $1,100. What a dramatic drop in price. But more than the drop in
Mm,
price is the increase in power. So the same footprint taken up by those panels now creates 2 to 3 times the amount of power that those panels create. It's a really good time to be put in solar, and the market, you can see, for solar panels is just exploding. So what I haven't paid any energy or water bills here for, I don't know, decades. So the sun gives the house all the light needed to provide the solar panels, and I've got batteries. But it's also a time for spivs and naughty solar companies. There's about a 20 to 30% failure rate in the solar industry in the residential sector. People are not getting good results, and now you can go to websites and you can get reliable companies that are expressed there. But you need to view residential energy, solar energy, as very different to commercial. Solar farms built to make money have what I would urge for the residential market. They pay according to the promised amount of power production. They have to, because they're spending money to build that solar farm to sell it. If they can only sell 40% of the projected amount of power, then they're not going to make money. So if you're a household and you're going to get solar, Don't get the cheapest. Look for somebody who's been around for 5 or 10 years and is likely to be around when you call on the warranty. It's different for you as a household to do that. But I'm holding up my hands above each other at an angle. Not only do you get the solar panels when you put them on, you also get cooling by the shade cast by the panels. So there's less heat on your roof. So you get less heat stress on your roof when you put that on. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's good. That does answer my question. Look, Michael, you've been a great source of inspiration for so long, and to hear you talk about it and some of the bigger issues, it's. I mean, most people are. I think a lot of people are switched on to this idea. Before we finish, I just wanted to take a step back because from your role as a sustainable householder in the inner city, in the city, and a campaigner, because we're all on a bit of a health journey through life in this modern world. What do you think the biggest challenge is for us as individuals on that journey?
If we can eat good food, usually available only from farmers directly, not through chain stores. If we can eat healthy food, we get 3 chances a day to look after our bodies, our mental and other dimensions of our body, but also to support the people who grow that. There's plenty of studies of the nutritional value of organic and homegrown or farm-grown food. So the short answer is buy locally grown food from local farmers with whom you can have a more trustworthy relationship. Try to cook it and use it in a healthy way. I love to cook, Ron, and I've become quasi-religious about my air fryer and my induction cooktop. My air fryer, I use no more than a tablespoon of oil in that. It's so efficient at cooking. It's a healthier way to make chips or scrambled eggs or things. So you get 3 chances a day to eat healthy food. And if you're buying food, try and buy it from farmers who grow the healthiest food. Does that answer your question?
That does answer my question, Michael, and thank you for not only joining us today and sharing your knowledge and wisdom, but for being such an incredibly inspiring member of our community. Thank you so much.
Lovely to talk to you, and I hope our discussion of interest to your listeners, and I wish you all well. See you later.
Thank you. Well, as I said, it's inspiring, and to know that it can be done in an inner city suburb of Sydney, and I've walked through that suburb, and Michael's impact on it is it's there for everybody to see, and he's not finished yet. I mean, eliminating food waste, cooling our cities. I mean, these things are all achievable. You know, we talk about the global warming, but there is stuff that we can do in our own neighbourhoods and in our own communities. And I've always found Michael's story to be incredibly inspiring. I hope you do too. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.